disputed by either side, President Putin finally announced what he said was a peace enforcement operation, a limited operation in Ukraine, though over the course of the day it's become increasingly clear that it encompasses much of Ukraine, with Russian forces advancing from Crimea, possibly also in the Kharkiv region and in areas around Kiev. I'm not a military person, as I have discussed on many occasions. I'm not in a position, therefore, to comment on the direction, progress, or nature of the military operation. All I would say is that it has a blitzkrieg appearance about it. The Ukrainian army seems to be putting up some resistance, but it appears to be disorganized. And it's clear that this situation, this military situation, from Ukraine's point of view, is rapidly becoming desperate. I would also say that shortly before I made this program, the Kremlin indicated the terms upon which it would be prepared to negotiate a ceasefire and an end to hostilities with the Ukrainian government. The first is that it would require a commitment from Ukraine to demilitarize. I'm not quite sure what that means. I don't think many people understand what that means, but possibly and perhaps it means Ukraine giving up most of its armed forces. And the second would be to change its constitution to incorporate within it a provision keeping Ukraine neutral. Now, there's no word yet about what the Ukrainian government is going to say in response to any of this, or whether it's even going to respond to any of this. Some MPs in the Ukrainian parliament have already come out and said that the President Zelensky, whose whereabouts, by the way, are unknown to me, should negotiate with the Kremlin, presumably on these terms. But at the moment, he seems to be calling various world leaders, making contradictory statements, showing yet again that he is hardly the right person to give clear and consistent leadership in this situation. And of course, and in the meantime, the United States, Britain, and the European Union are cranking up for the sanctions that they intend to impose, whilst the Russians, for their part, have arranged a meeting with between President Putin and various Russian industrial and economic leaders. And this meeting, over the course of this meeting, apparently the question of sanctions was talked about, with some agreement apparently that whatever the sanctions were, Russia would indeed be able to cope with them. I will come to that point further on in this program. Now, I have to say, before I proceed, that this is for me a deeply shocking affair. I have a particular horror of violence, including of political violence. I experienced it in my childhood in Greece, and it has never left me. One of the reasons I will admit that I've been skeptical about the idea of a Russian intervention in Ukraine, quite apart from the fact that those who have been purveying this story for many months have very little credibility in my eyes, has been the fact that this is the sort of event that I find extremely difficult to contemplate and to accept. Having said this, I'm going to resist some of the judgments that some people are already making about this affair. What I'm going to say about those is that moral judgments can be made, and they can be made very easily. Each person is entitled to them. I think it is more useful at a time like this to keep a clear head and to analyse this situation. And I'm going to say straight away that for me, what is now happening in Ukraine, shocking and terrible though it is, and something which I hope never to see, nonetheless does amount to the final and conclusive end of the unipolar moment, that period which began at the end of the Cold War in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, and over the course of which the United States wielded an uncontrolled, undisputed, and unrestrained hegemony. Now, this period of American power, not just of American power, but of American predominance. I remember reading articles which compared the power of the United States during this period to that of Imperial Rome in its heyday. That period of power has proved to be relatively short, and as was already obvious for some time, it was clearly fraying. The United States has for some time, as its military in particular have come to understand, been faced with a return, as the military put it, of great power competition. And the United States has noticed, or at least the US military have become aware, that the challenge from China and Russia, who are clearly coordinating together, I'm going to come to that shortly, has become increasingly great, and that it is able to challenge the United States in significant places and areas around the world. And indeed, we have seen since 2015 the Russian military intervention in Syria, which upended American plans in Syria. And we've seen also this steady growth of Chinese economic and military power, which is now, I think, becoming the single event which has been changing most decisively the political and economic geography of the world. And in Western Eurasia, in the area of the former Soviet Union, we are seeing what I have to say, in my opinion, is a new superpower starting to emerge. It's clear to me that a process is now taking place where Russia is once more assuming economic, political, military dominance of its space, is starting to fill the space left by the former Soviet Union. We saw the intervention recently in Kazakhstan. We've seen the steps taken to integrate Belarus into the Russian economic, military, and political system. And now we've seen the steps that Russia has taken with respect to Ukraine, which, to be straightforward about it, I suspect are going to be irreversible. I understand that Russia is going to face a rough time because of the sanctions. I'm speaking in my usual measured way, but I've no doubt at all, whatever those sanctions prove to be, that the Russians will ride them out. And I suspect that the geopolitical changes that are taking place in Ukraine are going to be irreversible. With Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine, or what was Ukraine, gradually being drawn together within the Russian system, the core territories of the former Soviet Union are once more falling under Moscow's sway, and as a result, and over the course of time, a new great power or superpower will emerge in Western Eurasia. And of that, personally, I have essentially no doubt. So how did we get here? Well, there are many reasons, there are many explanations, there's all sorts of reasons that one can give, but overall and ultimately, we have seen a catastrophic failure of Western policy. And I want to say this because obviously there'll be much discussion and anger focused on the personality of Vladimir Putin and on the decisions that he has made. But I think the important thing to understand is that for Putin and for the Russian leadership, and I suspect for much of the Russian people, the condemnation that they're getting from the West matters very little, because from their point of view, Ukraine is an existential issue. It is one which, as Putin went to great lengths to explain, both in the speech he gave on Monday after the Security Council meeting in Moscow and in a speech he gave earlier this morning when he announced the military operation in Ukraine. Ukraine is an existential issue, and its admission into NATO would, for the Russians, be seen as a disastrous development, one which would jeopardize not just their security, but their ability to function as a significant power or even as an independent power. And that was something which the Russians, who are obviously not just affected by older memories, those of the Second World War and of their earlier history, but also of the 1990s, when their country for a time fell very much under the domination of Western liberal influenced elites. For the Russians, any return to that kind of situation is clearly unacceptable. And that is why this operation, so far as I can judge, is receiving no criticism or very little criticism or opposition within Russia itself. I should say that I had a discussion earlier with a Russian friend of mine, somebody who lives in the Urals, but who has actually family in the Donbass. He is a critic of President Putin. Like many educated Russians who speak English, he is not by any means an admirer of President Putin. But nonetheless, he tells me that based on the experiences of his family in the Donbass, the fighting that has been going on there is real, despite claims to the contrary. And he also appears to accept the rationale that President Putin set out for the danger to Russia if Ukraine were ever to join NATO. And this is where, for me, the heart of the problem comes. That decision taken at the Bucharest at the summit meeting in 2008 to say that Georgia and Ukraine would one day become members of NATO. That invitation, which was extended to them by NATO, very much at the insistence of President George W. Bush and of his Vice President Dick Cheney, which was foolishly agreed to and accepted by all the Western powers, all the other NATO powers, has been a disaster. It has provoked and alarmed the Russians, and has at the same time given certain political forces in Ukraine encouragement in the belief that what they do will have Western backing. And the reality is, as we are now seeing, that despite all the brave talk about sanctions, despite all the words of condemnation that have been showered on President Putin and on Russia, ultimately the Western powers, the NATO alliance, are not prepared on behalf of Ukraine to fire a shot. Now, to be very clear about this, I personally would not want them to do so. I think the idea of the West getting into direct conflict with Russia would be a calamity of apocalyptic dimensions, but that made it doubly dangerous to make an offer of that nature to Ukraine, which the Western powers were never realistically going to see through. All that it has done is provoke a crisis within Ukraine itself, between Russian-speaking regions and Ukrainian-speaking regions, between those who look to Russia and those who preferred a more Western orientation. And it has also created conditions of conflict between Ukraine and Russia, a conflict which, in the end, the Russians would be determined to see through to its conclusion because of the existential nature of this issue for them, and which the Western powers were not in the end prepared to become involved in. To say it straightforwardly and frankly, Ukraine and its hapless president have been led up the garden path, and having been led up the garden path, they have been abandoned there as the bear comes on the prowl. So there we go. That was one particular aspect of this disaster. There is a second aspect of this disaster which really does need to be discussed and analysed, perhaps at greater length, that I'm going to be able to do in this programme. But for me, I suspect that the final straw for the Russians, the single event which more than any other in the last few weeks probably decided them to take this fateful step, was the meeting of the political advisors of the presidents under the Normandy format in Berlin on 11th February 2022. Now, up to this point, I still believe that the Russians had not made any decision to invade or attack or intervene in Ukraine. And I suspect that they might not even have done so had there not been conflict in the Donbass, which followed shortly after. But one event, I think, more than any other, would have crystallized Russian exasperation and suspicion about the whole affair. And that was this Normandy 4 meeting. The Russians had recently entertained President Macron of France. He'd come to Moscow. There'd been a lengthy meeting between him and President Putin. President Macron had appeared to be understanding of Russian concerns about the need for a new security architecture in Europe, about the need for an end to NATO expansion, about such things. And he also seemed to be understanding about Russian concerns, about the need for an internal settlement of the conflict in Ukraine along the basis set out in the Minsk Agreement of February 2015. So I think that the Russians probably hoped that when the political advisors of the presidents did eventually meet in Berlin on the 11th of February, some progress would be made to arrange some kind of meeting between the Ukrainian government and the representatives of the two republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, as required by the Minsk Agreement. Instead, what happened after 9 hours of talks was that Ukraine simply refused to budge. It flatly refused to budge. And we know, because the Russians have said so, that they blame this Ukrainian intransigence principally upon the United States, which they feel has been actively sabotaging the Minsk Agreement, but they also became extremely angry with the French and the Germans, who, as far as they were concerned, were colluding with this Ukrainian refusal to act out the Minsk Agreement. And I'm sorry to say, because I have an affection for Germany, a country with which I have family ties, that in my opinion, the actions of the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, whilst in Moscow, didn't help matters. I think Scholz went to Moscow hoping, expecting that he would be able to reinforce Macron's peace initiatives and to act in and to facilitate what he would call a de-escalation of the crisis. In the event, all he came with in terms of Ukraine's NATO entry was a verbal statement that as Ukraine's NATO entry was not on the agenda, anyone's agenda, there was simply no problem to discuss. Now, for the Russians, that would have been not only unacceptable, it would probably, at a certain level, have seemed even insulting. The Russians, after all, remember the various promises they were given back in 1990 that NATO would not expand an inch east. They have blamed themselves ever since for their failure to get those promises reduced to writing, and we were certainly not going to accept another verbal promise from a Western leader, even if that leader was the German Chancellor. And Scholz then, I think, compounded the Russian anger and aggravation by, first of all, bringing up the topic of Navalny, which obviously is completely irrelevant to this issue and must have seemed to the Russians frivolous and again insulting, given what the Russians see as Germany's role in the Navalny affair. But more particularly, he brought up the topic of NATO's bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, which he tried to justify, and he tried to justify it by referencing genocide in Yugoslavia, something which, of course, the Russians both reject and which they have come recently to start insisting applies to the situation in Donbass. Now, I've already made my own views about this very clear. I regard all rhetoric about genocide that we've been hearing from every side, Western, Russian, wherever, over the last 30 or so years, as completely wrong. For me, genocide is what happened during the Second World War in the areas controlled by Germany and which was carried out at that time against the Jewish people. Genocide is something that has been practiced in other places on massive scales. The kind of events that took place in Yugoslavia in 1999 and in Ukraine today, and also in certain regions of China, do not come close to any acceptable definition of genocide as far as I am concerned. But the fact is that word has become debased and misused in this sort of way, and given that that was so, and given Russian feelings on the matter, it was incredibly ill-advised for a German chancellor to start disagreeing with this and bringing up those sort of words in a meeting in Moscow. So I think that those two events, the meeting in Berlin of the Normandy 4 political advisors and Scholz's visit to Moscow, were probably the final catalysts for this affair, taken together with the resumption of fighting in the Donbass, which I have, admittedly through third parties, reason to believe has actually been taking place, and which, as I've discussed in my previous video, the OSCE monitors appear to confirm. So, this is the situation that we are now in. And can we just take a pause, a step back, and ask ourselves, how is it possible that we could have failed in the West so profoundly and so completely? Why did we give that commitment to Ukraine back in 2008, which we could not honor and which we have no intention of honouring? Why did we go on pretending that Ukraine would one day become a member of NATO, when it's quite obvious now that we're in no position to defend it? Why insist on a principle of an open door that has absolutely no reality and is not even set out in the treaty, in the Washington Treaty, in Article 10 of the Washington Treaty? Why not facilitate an internal settlement of the situation in Ukraine on the basis of the Minsk Accord, the Minsk Agreement, which Western powers, Germany and France, helped to broker, and which all the main Western powers, Britain, France, and the United States, voted to support in the Security Council. Why did we encourage Ukraine to think that it could ignore and disregard the provisions of the Minsk Agreement and do so indefinitely and at no cost to itself? Why did we look away, even as Ukraine, deeply dysfunctional society as it is, took steps internally to shore up the position of its elites and government by pursuing what I'm going to say straightforwardly were openly discriminatory policies against Russian speakers, steps which were only inevitably going to antagonize Russia and Moscow. We've shown no ability to think through this issue, no capacity for compromise, no understanding of the concerns and fears of our main interlocutor, which is Russia. And so the result is, as I said, that Ukraine has been led up the garden path and is now in the process of being overrun and defeated by a Russian army, a Russian military, immeasurably more powerful than itself, and which it is incapable of defeating, and which the Western powers are not going to help it defeat. So there we are, a disaster from every conceivable point of view, but a disaster first and foremost for Western policy. And it seems to me that whatever sanctions are imposed on Russia now, whatever effects people in the West seem to think those sanctions will have, it will not dent in any way, it won't even scratch the surface of the reality of this massive disaster Ukraine is experiencing and this enormous defeat which we in the West have now suffered. What is now happening is that we have had a massive demonstration of power being used against a country to which we made promises and which we are not in any position to do anything about. And this has not happened in some faraway place like Afghanistan or Iraq. This has happened in Europe, the place which is in some ways the fulcrum of Western power, and it has happened in a way which, as I said, presages the emergence of a new Russian great power rival of a sort that we have not had since the end of the Cold War. And of course it gets worse, because the Russians, having seen how we have acted, have increasingly been rearranging their political actions, and they have been, of course, forging relationships with China. And China, which is rapidly emerging as a great power to rival the United States, it's an economic rival of the United States in terms of purchasing power parity. It has actually exceeded in scale, its economy has exceeded in scale that of the United States, has over the course of the day made its position on this conflict entirely clear. It backs Russia. It backs Russia, which it sees as its partner in the challenge China is now facing and making with respect to the United States. And the position was set out unambiguously in a Chinese readout of a telephone conversation which took place earlier today between Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And this is the official Chinese readout. I will read it in full. On February 24th, 2022, State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi had a phone conversation with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Lavrov introduced the evolution of the current situation in Ukraine and Russia's position, saying that the United States and NATO broke their commitments, continued to expand eastward, refused to implement the Minsk II agreement, and violated UN Security Council Resolution 2202, and Russia was forced to take necessary measures to safeguard its rights and interests. Wang Yi said, China always respects all countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity. At the same time, we also see a complex and unique historical context on the Ukraine issue and understand Russia's legitimate concerns on security issues. China holds that the Cold War mentality should be completely abandoned and a balanced, effective and sustained security mechanism should be finally formed through dialogue and negotiation. So it's essentially, in the usual careful words that the Chinese use when discussing these events, it's essentially an endorsement of the Russian position. And I understand that the Chinese foreign policy spokesman has actually been more outspoken, and I understand that the Chinese media is becoming more outspoken too. It is, by the way, a myth that these events in Russia and Ukraine have isolated Russia. Just the other day, on Tuesday, the day after Putin recognized on behalf of Russia the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, he was receiving President Ilham Aliyev of Azerbaijan, who has actually signed a treaty of alliance with Russia.